Today we pick up with the growth of the cattle industry, and the cattle industry is based on two different things. You've got the pioneer, or the image of what the pioneer was, and that's going to help to boost the cattle industry, and then the Great Plains and what that was capable of producing. We're going to start with the pioneer, and the pioneer, there's two basic images of that pioneer and who they are and what they did. You have a romantic image, which is that they were a hardy people, that they were selfless, that they were coming out to spread civilization to the savage tribes of Native Americans. On the other hand, you had the tragic image of the pioneer, and that tragic image was more that they were ruthless and greedy, and they were destroying the environment, and they were destroying the civilizations, the Indian civilizations that they were encountering. Going with that, you have the Great Plains. Now, prior to the Civil War, the Great Plains were seen as the Great American Desert. They were a thing that you had to get across in order to get to the good stuff on the other side. It wasn't seen as having any useful purpose. However, after the Civil War, post-Civil War, gold is discovered in the Black Hills. You have silver that's discovered. The land, it's finally discovered, that is really good farmland, some of the best in the nation. And because of that, railroads start coming through, and we get the growth of the cattle industry. So, in order to make the cattle industry work, you had to have cowboys. And the first cowboys actually came from Latin and South America. They were called vaqueros, which is the Spanish word for cowboys. At first, these vaqueros in Mexico were native Aztec Indians. They started out on foot, and then when the Spanish started bringing over horses, they adapted to having horses as part of their job. The horses were work animals. They helped to provide with transportation, so it just made their job easier. And so these vaqueros became expert riders. They used lariats to rope and control the cattle herds, and then eventually they started to move the herds north to provide food for the miners that were mining gold and silver, and because there was better grassland available for them to feed their animals, feed the cattle. And so throughout the course of the cowboy period, we can see the influence of the Mexican culture in there. Americans are going to learn from the Mexicans on how to rope, how to brand, how to round up and care for their cattle. They take from the Mexican vaqueros how they dressed, what kind of food. Their vocabulary is going to be influenced by the Mexican vaqueros. So like words like spurs and chaps, beef jerky, ranch, corral, rodeo, all those are adapted from the Mexican vaqueros vocabulary. But the Americans are going to take it, the American cowboys are going to take it and develop it even beyond what the Mexican vaqueros had. For example, the Americans are going to adapt their boots to better suit their purposes. Their boots will have pointed toes and heels on them in order to better fit in the stirrup of the saddle and make it easier to slide in and out, because the fear was that if you got kicked off or bucked off your horse, that if your foot slid through the stirrup and your foot was lodged in there, that horse would drag you and you could end up severely injured or dead. And so that was an adaptation made by Americans in order to prevent that from happening. Another adaptation was the bandana, and that was purely health reasons, just to filter the dust from the air so that it made it more breathable, and so you weren't hawking up dirty loogies all the time. Another adaptation was the six-shooter and carrying a weapon with you. Not every cowboy did, but it was for their own protection, not so much against Indians. We're going to talk about the mythology later, but more to protect against wild animals. That was the bigger concern. So that leads us into the importance of the railroad. The railroad is the reason that cowboys exist, which is kind of weird because when you think of railroad, you don't think cowboys right away. Cowboys were not in great demand until the railroad came through the Great Plains. When the railroad came through the Great Plains, then there was transportation for getting the cattle to the East Coast for the people who wanted that cattle. So you needed to be able to get the cattle to the railroad. That's what you need the cowboys for. They were there to round up and herd the cattle towards the big cow towns where they would get on onto the railroad and then be transported back east. So the city dwellers, they wanted meat because of the Civil War. And during the Civil War, most of the cattle herds had been wiped out or at least severely damaged, both on the north and south side. So the result of this is that you have cattle trains from the south going up to the railroad towns, and so you get all kinds of trails. For example, the Chisholm Trail, which you can see on the map. After the Civil War, the demand for beef increases. Like I said, the Civil War took a huge toll on people's herds, and so you had these huge cattle drives that you needed cowboys for. And then with that, you had the development of cow towns, because now that you have this new occupation, they're getting paid, they want to go spend their money, so these cow towns are built up around the cattle industry. And then you have this concept of Colonel Colt, and Colonel Colt is basically a nickname for your weapon, or for the Colt 6 shooter. And that's because there really wasn't much law in the Great Plains region yet. Law enforcement really wasn't very stringent. It also wasn't widely around. It was very sporadic in terms of there might be a sheriff in the town and there might not be. And it might be somebody who could be easily bribed and it might not be. So Colonel Colt, it was the law of the land that if your weapon was your law, basically. Between 1865 and 1885, there were roughly 40,000 cowboys in existence as an occupation. So not terribly a lot, and they were only around for about a 20-year period, so it's not like it was for 100 years or anything. So it's kind of interesting that they're so widely known, but the truth about cowboys, it's kind of interesting because cowboys are kind of our native mythology. We don't have a native mythology, not like European countries that have Greek gods or the Norse gods or even Asian mythology about how the world started. Our country is not old enough. We have a very young country compared to basically the rest of the world. And so we kind of felt left out. And what Americans did, we made up our own mythology, and we create this mythology around heroes. And one of the earliest heroes is going to be the cowboy. The heyday of the cowboy, 1867 to 1887, roughly. So, it's about a 20-year period. And the fiction behind it, the story or the mythology behind it, is that these cowboys were mostly white. They were out fighting bad guys, taking down train robbers and bank robbers and fighting the Indians and shootouts and all that kind of stuff. They were heroes. They were romanticized. But the truth is they really were not like that. The truth is that these cowboys worked 10 to 14 hours a day on the ranch. So they don't really have a whole lot of time to go fight crime. When they're on the trail, they were working 18 hours. Their average age was about 24, so they're fairly young. This was a young man's job. It's not something for an older generation. By the time they're 40, they're pretty broken down because of health concerns. Their health is poor due to the weather that they're in. Breathing in all that dust is not healthy. Their hygiene, it's kind of hard to stay clean on the trail. And a lot of them end up being bow-legged because being in the saddle so much, they were constantly, their bones will form to that barrel shape. So it did make for some interesting walking styles, I guess. They may have carried a gun, but if they did, it was rarely used. Like I said, it was mostly for protection against wild animals like rattlesnakes or wolves or coyotes or things like that. It was not... If they really didn't have much contact with Indians, so if they saw one, they really weren't going to shoot them. Most of the Indians by this time were on reservation systems, so it was not something that they did. That wasn't part of their job description. In the summer, they worked on the ranch, and in the winter, they lived off their savings because the ranch didn't need them anymore, so they don't have a steady job. It was a seasonal job. It was only in the summers, and so in the winter, they would travel from ranch to ranch trying to pick up an odd job, maybe mending a fence or helping out on the farm with calving or something like that. So they really didn't have a whole lot that they could do in the winter. So if they didn't save up their money, which a lot of them spent it right away, it did make for some tough times for them. But throughout this, you get the legends of the cowboys. And the legends, when we talk about the legends, we're talking about like Billy the Kid or Wild Bill Hickok or Buffalo Bill Cody, those people. But most of them were never cowboys in the true sense of the word. They maybe in their youth did a year or two as a cowboy, but the vast majority of them end up being entertainers or expert marksmen, or actually some of them turn to crime. And so it does cause some difficulty calling them cowboys when they weren't really cowboys. But their lives and their deeds, a lot of it was made up, were spread by these dime novels that the people back east just ate up. They thought it was amazing what these people were doing. And these dime novels, they were little books that you could buy for a dime, and it told of the exploits of Billy the Kid, the shootout that he had or whatever. The vast majority of it was made up. It's not even true. So that brings us to the end of the cattle frontier. The end of the cattle frontier comes about because of several things. The first is natural disasters. They just started having some problems. They were overgrazing their pastures. They didn't know about conservation and how to make sure that you're going to have enough grass for the next year. In addition, they had a drought in 1883 and 1886. That's going to lead to prairie fires, which is going to destroy more of the grazing land. There's also a huge blizzard in 1887, and that blizzard lasts 3 days. It drops to a negative 68 degrees. It snowed an inch an hour. And so a lot of ranchers lost 40 to 90% of their herds. And so that is the big thing that kind of brings about the end of the cattle industry. The second major thing is barbed wire. Now, Joseph Glidden invents this in 1873, and the idea behind it is that it was to portion off pieces of land that you didn't want the cattle grazing on. Because of the drought, because of the blizzards, a lot of farmers decided to raise hay in order to offset any bad weather. And so you didn't want your cattle eating up your hay crop. You wanted that to be able to use in the winter or if you had a drought again. And so you got to keep the cattle out. Well, Joseph Glidden figured out a way to close off that grazing land, and that was with barbed wire. So this was to prevent the trampling, basically. So a lot of ranchers began putting up barbed wire fences. It was cheap. It was easy to use. It doesn't take much to put it up. It's pretty simple, pretty easy, and it catches on pretty fast. In 1874, just 1 year after it was invented, Joseph Glidden sold 10,000 pounds of it. And 4 years later, in 1878, 27 million pounds. So you can see how fast it caught on and how prevalent it becomes. And so it's one of the things that's going to lead to the end of the cattle industry, just because there's so much barbed wire and everything is portioned off that there's no way to do a cattle drive anymore without running into barbed wire or running into somebody else's property. And so instead we're going to see farming, agriculture develop as opposed to ranching develop on the Great Plains.